My name is Judith Monroe, but everyone calls me Judy. I'm 70 years old now, and when I look back at my life, it feels like watching a movie painted in watercolors. Some scenes bright and vivid, others faded and blurred, but all of them part of the same beautiful, messy canvas. I was born in 1954 in a small apartment on Chicago's South Side. My mother was a seamstress. My father worked at the steel mill. We didn't have much money, but our little home was filled with something more precious: love and creativity. My earliest memory is of my mother humming while she sewed, the sound of her singer machine creating its own rhythm, like music mixed with magic. But it was the colors that called to me first. I remember being 3 years old, sitting on our kitchen linoleum, completely mesmerized by a puddle of spilled grape juice. The way the purple liquid caught the morning light streaming through our window, it was like discovering treasure. I dipped my finger in it and started drawing on the floor. My mother found me there, purple-stained and grinning, surrounded by my first masterpiece. That was the moment everything changed. Instead of scolding me, she knelt down and said, "Judy, honey, you see the world differently than most people. That's a gift." She went to the five and dime store that very afternoon and bought me my first set of watercolors, a tiny tin box with 8 colors that might as well have been a chest full of diamonds. I spent my childhood painting everything I could see: the rust stains on our fire escape, the way shadows danced on brick walls, the faces of neighbors sitting on stoops in the summer heat. My parents didn't understand art, but they understood passion. They saw how painting made me come alive, how I could disappear for hours with just a brush and some paper. Art became my language before I even knew I needed one. While other kids played with dolls or trucks, I painted stories. I painted my dreams, my fears, my hopes for a future I couldn't yet imagine. Every stroke of the brush was like taking a breath, necessary, natural, essential. Little did I know that this love affair with color and canvas would carry me through the most beautiful and heartbreaking moments of my life. Art would be my companion through first love, marriage, loss, and everything in between. It would break my heart and heal it, sometimes in the same day. If my story teaches you anything, I hope it's this: never underestimate the power of following what makes you feel alive. That thing that calls to your soul when you're 3 years old, that's not just a hobby. That's your compass pointing toward who you're meant to become. So stick with me as I tell you about a life lived in full color, with all the light and shadow that makes any good painting worth looking at. Subscribe to hear how a little girl with purple-stained fingers grew up to paint her way through life's greatest joys and deepest sorrows. Growing up in Chicago in the 1960s, I was what you'd call an unusual child. While my classmates played hopscotch and jump rope, I sat in corners sketching their faces, trying to capture the way Sarah's eyes crinkled when she laughed, or how Tommy's freckles looked like tiny constellations across his nose. My elementary school teachers didn't know what to make of me. I was the girl who paid more attention to the way sunlight fell across the classroom floor than to multiplication tables. During lunch, instead of eating, I'd arrange my food by color: orange carrots, white bread, red apples, creating little still lives on my lunch tray. Judith daydreams too much, my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, told my parents during conferences. What she didn't understand was that I wasn't daydreaming, I was seeing, really seeing. The world was full of so much beauty that most people walked right past. I couldn't understand how they missed it. My father worked double shifts at the steel mill to keep food on our table. His hands were always stained with grease and metal dust, but when he came home, he'd sit and watch me paint with such pride in his eyes. "My little artist," he'd say, even though I knew he didn't really understand what I was creating. My mother was different. She had an eye for beauty too, though hers showed up in different ways. She could make our tiny apartment feel like a palace, with carefully placed doilies and flowers picked from empty lots. She taught me that art wasn't just about what you put on canvas. It was about how you arranged your life, how you found beauty in ordinary moments. When I turned 10, my parents made a sacrifice that still brings tears to my eyes. They enrolled me in Saturday art classes at the community center downtown. It meant my mother had to work extra hours cleaning offices, and my father had to give up his one day off. But they believed in my gift, even when I wasn't sure I believed in it myself. Those Saturday mornings changed everything. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who understood that the world was made of light and shadow, texture and form. My instructor, Mrs. Rodriguez, was a real artist who had studied in Mexico City. She taught us that every brushstroke was a decision, every color choice was an emotion. "Don't just paint what you see, Judith," she would say, standing behind my easel. "Paint what you feel. Paint what the scene is trying to tell you." I started experimenting with different mediums: oils, acrylics, pastels, charcoal. Each one felt like learning a new language. Oils moved slowly, deliberately, like honey. Watercolors were unpredictable, spreading and bleeding in ways I couldn't always control. Pastels were soft and forgiving, letting me blend colors with my fingers until my hands looked like rainbow clouds. But it was during those Saturday classes that I first experienced what I now know was artistic breakthrough. I was painting a simple bowl of fruit, nothing special, just something Mrs. Rodriguez had set up for us to practice with. But as I worked, something magical happened. The pears and apples on my canvas started to feel more real than the actual fruit sitting on the table. They had weight, presence, soul. "You found it," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered behind me. "You found the place where technique meets heart." I was 12 years old, and I had discovered that I could create life with paint and brushes. I could make people feel something just by the way I arranged colors on canvas. It was better than any superpower I'd ever read about in comic books. The other kids at school still thought I was weird, but I didn't care anymore. I had found my calling, my purpose, my reason for being. Every day after school, I rushed home to paint until dinner. Weekends were spent exploring Chicago with my sketchbook, drawing everything from pigeons on park benches to the way steam rose from manholes in winter. My bedroom walls were covered with my artwork, portraits of family members, landscapes of places I'd never been, but somehow knew in my heart, abstract pieces that captured feelings I didn't have words for yet. My parents had to buy extra thumbtacks just to keep up with my productivity. By the time I reached high school, I knew with absolute certainty what I wanted to do with my life. High school brought new challenges and new possibilities. Lincoln High wasn't known for its arts program, but they had one dedicated art teacher, Mr. Thompson, who saw something in me that even I didn't fully recognize yet. He was a tall, quiet man who wore paint-splattered sweaters and had the most encouraging smile I'd ever seen. "Judith," he said during my first week of sophomore year, "I think you're ready for something bigger than what we can offer here." He helped me apply for a summer program at the Art Institute of Chicago. It was competitive, expensive, and seemed impossible for a working-class kid like me. But Mr. Thompson believed in my work enough to help me put together a portfolio that would change my life. I spent weeks agonizing over which pieces to include. Each painting felt like a piece of my soul I was offering up for judgment. There were my portraits of neighborhood kids, landscapes of Chicago's lakefront, and abstract pieces that captured the feeling of walking through the city at different times of day. The night before the portfolio review, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the ways I might not be good enough, all the reasons why a girl from my neighborhood shouldn't dream so big. But when I walked into that review room and saw how the judges leaned forward to study my work, how they whispered to each other and nodded, I knew something special was happening. I got accepted. Full scholarship. That summer at the Art Institute was like being given permission to breathe for the first time. I was surrounded by serious young artists from all over the Midwest. Some came from families with money, private art lessons, and studios in their homes. Others, like me, were hungry kids who had scraped and saved for this opportunity. It was there that I met David Chun, a sculptor from Milwaukee, whose hands could make clay look like it was breathing. David was quiet, intense, and completely dedicated to his art. We spent hours in the studios, working side by side, sharing ideas and techniques. He taught me to see sculpture as painting in 3 dimensions. I taught him about color theory and how light could transform any surface. Our first kiss happened in front of one of my paintings, a swirling abstract piece I'd created after walking through Chicago during a thunderstorm. You paint the way I wish I could live, he whispered against my lips. I was 16 and absolutely certain this was what love felt like. David and I spent the rest of that summer inseparable. We'd sneak up to the roof of the Art Institute after hours, bringing sketchbooks and sharing dreams about the lives we wanted to create. He wanted to have sculptures in galleries across the world. I wanted to paint pieces that would make people stop in their tracks and remember what it felt like to be human. When the program ended and we had to return to our separate cities, we promised to stay in touch. This was before cell phones and email. We had to rely on handwritten letters and expensive long-distance phone calls. For a while, we managed. His letters were full of descriptions of new techniques he was learning, galleries he'd visited, dreams that seemed to grow bigger with each page. But distance has a way of wearing down even the strongest teenage love. By Christmas, our letters came less frequently. By spring, they had stopped altogether. I threw myself into my art, creating some of my most emotionally raw pieces during that time. Pain, it turned out, was an incredible teacher. Senior year brought college applications and big decisions about my future. My parents wanted me to have something practical to fall back on, so I applied to schools where I could study art education. The idea was that I could teach art to support myself while pursuing my own work. But then came the letter that would change everything. The School of the Art Institute of Chicago had accepted me into their bachelor's program with a partial scholarship. It wasn't enough to cover everything, but it was enough to make the dream possible if I was willing to work for it. I spent that spring working at a local diner after school, saving every tip for college. My mother took in extra sewing work. My father picked up weekend shifts. We were all investing in a dream that none of us fully understood, but all of us believed in. The night before I left for college, I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by all the paintings I'd created over the years. They told the story of a girl who had always seen the world differently, who had learned to trust her vision, even when others couldn't understand it. Tomorrow, I would begin the next chapter of that story. College was like stepping into a completely different world. The School of the Art Institute of Chicago was full of serious, passionate young artists who spoke about color theory and composition the way other people talked about the weather. Everyone seemed so sophisticated, so sure of themselves and their artistic vision. I felt like a fraud those first few weeks. My classmates came from art families, had studied with private tutors, had been to museums in Paris and Rome. Meanwhile, I was still wearing clothes my mother had sewn and carrying art supplies I'd bought at discount stores. But something magical happened when I started putting paint to canvas. All those insecurities disappeared the moment I picked up a brush. I discovered that technique could be learned, but vision, that came from somewhere deeper. And I had vision in abundance. My painting professor, Elena Vasquez, was a renowned artist whose work hung in galleries across the country. She was intimidating at first, sharp-tongued, demanding, never satisfied with anything less than complete honesty on canvas. But she saw something in my work that made her push me harder than anyone else in the class. "You paint with your heart first, your head second," she told me during a critique that left half the class in tears. Most artists spend years trying to unlearn their techniques enough to access that kind of authenticity. "Don't you dare lose it trying to fit in here." Those words became my compass. I stopped trying to paint like my classmates and started painting like myself. My work became more bold, more emotionally raw. I painted the Chicago I knew, not the tourist version, but the real city with its beauty and grit, its hope and desperation all mixed together. It was during my sophomore year that I created the painting that would change my life. I was walking home from a late night in the studio when I witnessed a car accident. No one was seriously hurt, but for a moment, as the cars sat twisted together under a streetlight, everything felt suspended in time. The broken glass caught the light like scattered stars. The steam from the radiators created an almost ethereal atmosphere. I went straight back to the studio and painted for 12 hours straight. The resulting piece, Intersection, captured not just what I had seen, but what I had felt in that moment when ordinary life revealed its fragility and beauty. Professor Vasquez took one look at it and grabbed my arm. "Judith, this needs to be in the student exhibition. This is gallery quality work." The annual student exhibition was a big deal. It was where art dealers, gallery owners, and collectors came to discover new talent. Most students never got their work selected, especially not underclassmen like me. But Intersection was chosen, and on the night of the opening, I stood in the gallery wearing my one good dress borrowed from my roommate, watching strangers stop and stare at my painting. Some stood there for minutes, just taking it in. I saw tears in a few people's eyes. Then it happened. A woman in an elegant black dress approached me. "Are you Judith Monroe?" she asked. "I'm Catherine Williams from the Williams Gallery. I'd like to talk to you about your work." Catherine Williams was a legend in Chicago's art scene. Her gallery had launched the careers of artists I'd only dreamed of meeting. And she wanted to talk to me about my painting. "There's something in your work that I haven't seen in years," she said as we stood in front of Intersection. "You capture the sacred in the ordinary. That's a rare gift." She offered to include one of my pieces in a group show she was curating for emerging artists. It would be my first real gallery exhibition, my first chance to sell my work to serious collectors. I called my parents that night, crying so hard I could barely speak. "Mom, I'm going to be in a real gallery show." I managed to say between sobs, "Oh, honey," my mother said, and I could hear the pride and amazement in her voice. "We always knew you were special, but this is bigger than anything we ever imagined." The months leading up to the gallery show were a whirlwind of preparation. Catherine worked with me to select the perfect piece and helped me understand how the art world worked. She taught me about pricing, about talking to collectors, about presenting myself as a professional artist. My piece sold on the opening night. A young couple bought it for their new home. And when I met them, they told me how much the painting meant to them. "It reminds us that there's beauty even in difficult moments," the woman said. That night, walking home through the Chicago streets with a check for more money than I'd ever seen at one time, I felt like I was finally becoming the person I was meant to be. I was 20 years old, a real artist with work hanging in galleries. The little girl who painted with grape juice on her kitchen floor had grown up to create art that moved people. But the best part wasn't the money or the recognition. It was knowing that I had found my voice as an artist, and that voice had something important to say. After my first gallery success, I threw myself deeper into Chicago's art scene. I moved out of the dorms, and into a shared loft space in Wicker Park with 3 other artists. It was gloriously messy, canvases everywhere, paint-stained floors, and the constant sound of creation happening in every corner. My roommates were all different types of artists. Maria was a photographer who captured intimate portraits of people on the street. Jake created massive sculptures from found objects. And then there was Tommy Reeves, a musician who could make his guitar sing in ways that gave me chills. Tommy was everything I'd never thought I wanted in a man. He was tall and lanky, with hair that always looked like he'd just rolled out of bed. His jeans had holes in them, not because it was fashionable, but because he'd worn them so much they'd simply given up. He lived on coffee, cigarettes, and whatever leftover pizza someone had brought home. But when Tommy played music, something magical happened. His entire being transformed. His fingers moved across the guitar strings like they were painting melodies in the air. He wrote songs about ordinary people living extraordinary inner lives. Exactly the kind of stories I tried to tell with my paintings. We circled each other for months, like two shy animals who weren't sure if the other was friend or foe. I'd paint while he practiced, both of us pretending we weren't stealing glances at each other's work. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me paint with this expression of wonder, as if he couldn't believe what my hands could create. Our first real conversation happened during a thunderstorm that knocked out the power in our building. We all gathered in the main room with candles, and Tommy started playing acoustic songs. His voice was rough and honest, full of the kind of pain that makes beautiful art possible. "Your music makes me want to paint differently," I told him when he finished a particularly haunting song about growing up poor in Detroit. "Your paintings make me hear colors," he said back, and something clicked between us that night. We started spending more time together, not dating exactly, but existing in each other's creative spaces. He'd play while I painted. I'd sketch while he wrote lyrics. We became each other's muse without even realizing it. Tommy introduced me to Chicago's underground music scene. We'd spend nights in smoky clubs listening to jazz, blues, folk, and experimental music that pushed boundaries the same way visual art did. I started seeing connections between music and painting that I'd never noticed before. Both were about rhythm, both were about emotion, both were about finding beauty in unexpected places. My paintings began to change. They became more dynamic, more rhythmic. I started incorporating musical elements, not literally, but in the way I structured compositions, the way colors flowed and crashed into each other like different instruments in a band. "You're painting symphonies now," Professor Vasquez observed during a critique. "There's music in your brushstrokes." Tommy and I finally kissed on New Year's Eve, 1975. We were on the roof of our building, watching fireworks over the lake. He had been playing guitar all evening, and when midnight came, he put the instrument down and looked at me with those deep brown eyes. "I've been wanting to do this for months," he whispered, and then his lips were on mine. It tasted like coffee and cigarettes and possibility. We became inseparable after that. Tommy would play at small venues around the city, and I'd sit in the audience, sketching the way the stage lights caught his face, the way his body moved with the music. He wrote songs inspired by my paintings. One called Colors in Motion became a favorite at his shows. Our loft became a gathering place for other artists, musicians, writers, and dreamers. We'd have parties that lasted until dawn, filled with passionate conversations about art, politics, and what it meant to live an authentic life. Those were some of the happiest times of my life, surrounded by creativity, in love with a man who understood my soul, feeling like anything was possible. Catherine Williams started representing more of my work, and I was selling pieces regularly now. Tommy was building a following too, playing bigger venues, and working on his first album. We were young, talented, and madly in love. The world felt like our oyster. But living that bohemian lifestyle wasn't always easy. Money was constantly tight. We survived on cheap pasta, day-old bread from the bakery, and the kindness of friends who'd share meals. Some nights we'd choose between buying art supplies or groceries. "We're rich in everything that matters," Tommy would say when I worried about our financial situation. He was right, but it didn't make the reality any less stressful sometimes. Despite the struggles, those years with Tommy were magical. We were creating art together, supporting each other's dreams, and building a life that was completely our own. I learned what it meant to be part of a creative partnership where both people could shine. Little did I know that this beautiful, chaotic period was just the beginning of our story together. Tommy proposed to me in the most perfectly imperfect way possible. It was 1977, and we'd been together for 2 years of beautiful chaos. I was in the middle of painting a large canvas, one of my city series that captured Chicago's energy at different times of day, when he walked into my studio space with his guitar and an expression I'd never seen before. "I wrote you something," he said, settling onto the paint-splattered stool I kept for visitors. He started playing, and the melody was unlike anything he'd written before, softer, more vulnerable, but with an underlying strength that made my hands stop moving on the canvas. Then he started singing, "Judy paints the morning light, colors dancing in her eyes. I want to wake up next to art for the rest of my life." When he finished, he set down his guitar and got on one knee right there among my easels and paint tubes. The ring was a simple silver band with a small stone that caught the light like one of my paint drops. "I don't have much money," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "but I have love, and I have faith that we can create a beautiful life together. Will you marry me?" I said yes before he even finished the question, and then I was in his arms, getting paint all over his favorite flannel shirt. We both started crying and laughing at the same time. It was perfect, messy, artistic, and completely us. We got married 6 months later in a small ceremony at a friend's art gallery. Instead of traditional wedding flowers, we decorated with my paintings and live plants from the botanical garden. Tommy wrote our wedding song, and he played it as I walked down the aisle in a vintage dress I'd found at a thrift store and altered myself. My parents came up from their neighborhood, looking slightly overwhelmed by our bohemian friends, but bursting with pride. My father, still wearing his best suit that smelled faintly of the steel mill, walked me down the aisle with tears streaming down his face. "I never understood what you were creating, sweetheart," he whispered to me before giving me away, "but I've always understood how much love you put into it." Marriage didn't change the fundamental dynamic between Tommy and me. We were still creative partners, still best friends, still each other's biggest supporters. But it deepened everything. There was a security now, a sense that we were building something permanent together. We moved into a slightly larger space, still in Wicker Park, still shared with another artist, but now we had our own bedroom and a corner where we could work together without stepping on anyone else's projects. I set up a proper studio space with good lighting and room to work on multiple pieces simultaneously. My art was evolving rapidly during this period. The financial stress of early marriage pushed me to be more productive and more focused. I developed a signature style that art critics started calling urban poetry, paintings that captured the soul of city life through bold colors and dynamic compositions. Catherine Williams was thrilled with my progress. "You're ready for a solo show," she announced during one of our monthly meetings. A solo show, every artist's dream. My own exhibition, my own opening night, my name on the gallery wall. We scheduled it for the spring of 1978. I spent months preparing, creating a cohesive body of work that told the story of love, art, and life in the city. Tommy was incredibly supportive, taking on extra gigs to help with expenses, and spending hours listening to me obsess over every detail. The opening night of Urban Heart, Paintings by Judith Monroe, was magical. The gallery was packed with collectors, other artists, and people who had been following my work since that first student exhibition. Tommy played background music, creating the perfect atmospheric soundtrack for viewing my paintings. By the end of the evening, I had sold 8 pieces, more than enough to cover our rent for several months and buy supplies for my next series. More importantly, I felt like I had truly arrived as an artist. Critics wrote positive reviews, collectors were interested in commissioning work, and other galleries started reaching out. "You did it, babe," Tommy said as we walked home that night, my hand in his, both of us slightly drunk on champagne and success. "You're a real artist now." "I was always a real artist," I corrected him, squeezing his hand. "Now I'm just a real artist who can pay the rent." Our life together had found its rhythm. I painted during the day while Tommy worked on music, and in the evenings we'd come together to share what we'd created. Weekends were for gallery openings, concerts, and long walks through the city collecting inspiration. We started talking about the future, maybe buying a small house with a proper studio, maybe Tommy recording that album he'd been dreaming about, maybe even starting a family someday. Everything felt possible when we were together. But as any artist knows, life has a way of throwing unexpected challenges at you just when things seem to be going perfectly. The first sign that something was wrong came during the winter of 1979. Tommy had been complaining of being tired all the time, which we initially blamed on his late-night gig schedule and our general bohemian lifestyle. But when he started losing weight rapidly and developing a persistent cough, we knew something more serious was happening. "It's probably just stress," I told myself as I watched him struggle to get through a performance one night. He was pale, sweating, and had to stop between songs to catch his breath. But even as I said it, I felt a cold fear growing in my chest. The doctor's office was sterile and intimidating, nothing like our warm, chaotic artistic world. Tommy sat on the examination table in one of those paper gowns, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. I held his hand while we waited for test results that would change our lives forever. "I'm afraid it's lung cancer," Dr. Peterson said, his words hitting us like a physical blow. "Stage 3, which means it's aggressive, but we have treatment options." The world tilted sideways in that moment. Cancer. The word felt foreign and terrifying. Tommy was only 28 years old. How could someone so young and vital have cancer? What followed were months of chemotherapy, radiation, and a kind of hope mixed with terror that I'd never experienced before. Tommy was brave, braver than I could have been. He continued writing music even when the treatments left him weak and nauseous. Some of his most beautiful songs came from this period, raw and honest pieces about facing mortality and finding meaning in suffering. I painted through it all. Art became my way of processing emotions too big for words. My paintings from this time were darker, more abstract, full of swirling colors that seemed to be fighting each other. But there was beauty in them too, the kind of desperate beauty that comes from knowing how precious and fragile life really is. "Keep painting," Tommy would whisper on his worst days. "Promise me you'll keep painting no matter what happens." The treatments seemed to be working at first. Tommy's energy returned somewhat, and we dared to hope that we were beating this thing. We planned a small vacation to the Michigan coast, where Tommy wanted to write songs by the lake, and I could paint the endless horizon. That trip was bittersweet perfection. We rented a tiny cabin and spent our days creating art, and our nights talking about everything and nothing. Tommy played guitar on the beach, while I painted watercolor sketches of the way the light changed throughout the day. For a few precious weeks, we almost forgot about the cancer. But cancer doesn't forget about you. The relapse came quickly and aggressively. By Christmas of 1980, Tommy was back in the hospital more often than he was home. I practically lived in that hospital room, setting up a small easel by the window so I could paint while keeping him company. "You're painting me better," he joked one day, looking at a portrait I was working on. It was true. In my paintings, Tommy looked healthy and vibrant, the way I wanted to remember him. "I'm painting the truth," I told him. "The illness isn't the truth. This is the truth." I gestured to the canvas, where I'd captured his eyes full of love and music still waiting to be written. Tommy died on March 15th, 1981. I was holding his hand, and his last words to me were, "Paint something beautiful, Judy. Paint something that will help people remember what love looks like." The grief was like nothing I'd ever experienced. It was physical, emotional, spiritual, a complete dismantling of everything I thought I knew about life. For weeks, I couldn't paint at all. I couldn't even look at my easel without breaking down. My friends rallied around me, bringing food, helping with arrangements, and just sitting with me when words weren't enough. Catherine Williams postponed a planned exhibition, telling me to take all the time I needed. But eventually, I picked up a brush again. Because that's what artists do. We create meaning from chaos, beauty from pain, hope from despair. My first painting after Tommy's death was a portrait of his hands on his guitar strings. It took me 3 months to finish because I kept crying onto the canvas, but when it was done, it captured something essential about who he had been. Art became my lifeline through grief, my way of staying connected to love even after loss. And slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild a life that looked completely different from the one I'd planned. The apartment felt impossibly empty without Tommy's guitar music filling the corners. His instruments sat silent, gathering dust, and I couldn't bear to move them. For months, I walked around them like sacred objects, afraid that touching them would somehow make his absence more real. I threw myself into painting with an intensity that bordered on obsession, working 12, 14-hour days, creating piece after piece that explored themes of loss, memory, and the continuation of love beyond death. My style evolved dramatically during this period, becoming more expressionistic, more raw. Catherine Williams was concerned about my work pace, but couldn't argue with the results. "These are the most powerful paintings you've ever created, Judith," she told me during one of our meetings. "They're heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time." The paintings from this period, what I privately called my grief series, were unlike anything in my previous work. They were larger, more emotionally explosive, painted with a kind of desperate energy that came from channeling pain into creation. Colors clashed and harmonized in ways that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. One piece in particular, Empty Symphony, showed Tommy's guitar in our apartment with visible sound waves painted in gold emerging from it, even though no one was playing. It suggested that music continues even after the musician is gone, that love echoes in spaces long after the lover has left. A year after Tommy's death, Catherine organized an exhibition of my grief series. We called it Love Letters to the Lost, and it opened on what would have been Tommy's 30th birthday. I almost couldn't go to my own opening. The thought of watching strangers look at such personal work felt overwhelming. But something magical happened that night. People weren't just looking at my paintings. They were connecting with them on a deeply personal level. I watched viewers stand in front of Empty Symphony with tears in their eyes, clearly thinking about their own losses, their own loves that continued beyond death. A woman approached me during the opening, an older lady with kind eyes and silver hair. "My husband died 2 years ago," she said quietly. "I haven't been able to talk about it with anyone. But your paintings, they say everything I've been feeling. Thank you for painting what the rest of us can't find words for." That night, I sold more paintings than I ever had at a single show. But more importantly, I realized that my art had found a deeper purpose. I wasn't just creating beautiful objects anymore. I was creating emotional bridges, helping people process their own experiences of love and loss. The success allowed me to move into my own place for the first time since Tommy's death. I found a small studio apartment in Logan Square with huge windows and enough space for a proper painting setup. Moving out of our shared space felt like another goodbye, but also like a step toward whatever my life was going to become next. I started teaching part-time at a community art center, working with adults who wanted to explore painting later in life. It was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. These students weren't trying to become professional artists. They just wanted to learn to see the world differently, to express themselves in new ways. "You teach us to paint like we're learning to breathe," one of my students told me. Her name was Eleanor, and she was 72 years old, taking her first art class after retiring from 40 years of nursing. Teaching reminded me why I had fallen in love with art in the first place. It wasn't just about creating beautiful objects. It was about developing a way of seeing, a way of being present in the world, a way of finding meaning in ordinary moments. Slowly, very slowly, I began to build a new life. It looked nothing like the one I'd planned with Tommy, but it had its own richness, its own purpose. I was learning that grief doesn't replace love. It transforms it, deepens it, makes it more precious because you understand how fragile it is. My paintings from this rebuilding period were quieter than the grief series, but no less powerful. They explored themes of solitude, resilience, and finding beauty in unexpected places. I painted urban landscapes that showed the city as a place where people could reinvent themselves, where new stories could begin even after great losses. By 1985, I had established myself as a serious artist with a distinctive voice and a growing reputation. But I was also a different person than the young woman who had married Tommy with such bright hopes for the future. I was stronger, more independent, more aware of life's fragility and preciousness. I thought this was who I would be forever, the widowed artist creating meaning from solitude, finding purpose in helping others express their own stories through paint and canvas. The Community Arts Center where I taught became my second home during the late 1980s and into the 1990s. What started as a way to supplement my income from gallery sales turned into something much more meaningful, a calling I hadn't expected to find. My students were mostly older adults, people who had spent decades focused on careers, raising families, and meeting everyone else's needs before their own. Now, in their retirement years, they were finally giving themselves permission to explore creativity. There was Margaret, a former bank executive who painted delicate flower studies with the same precision she'd once applied to financial reports. Frank, a retired mechanic whose abstract pieces were surprisingly emotional and sophisticated. Ruth, who had raised 6 children and now created whimsical paintings of the grandchildren who brought her such joy. But it was Eleanor who taught me the most about resilience and second chances. She had been widowed for 10 years when she first came to my class, and like me, she was learning to rebuild a life alone. Her paintings started tentatively, careful, controlled landscapes that revealed very little of her inner world. "I don't know if I'm any good at this," she confided to me after our third session, looking frustrated at her canvas. "Good at what?" I asked. "At expressing yourself, at finding beauty in the world, at learning something new at 72? Eleanor, you're already succeeding at all of those things." Over the months, I watched Eleanor's confidence grow along with her artistic skills. Her paintings became bolder, more personal. She started experimenting with color combinations that reflected her emotions rather than just copying what she saw. She painted memories, her childhood home, her wedding day, quiet moments with her late husband that she wanted to preserve forever. "You've given me a new way to remember," she told me one day. "Before, I could only hold these moments in my mind. Now I can hold them in my hands. Teaching these older students changed my own approach to art. I started focusing more on the emotional and spiritual aspects of painting rather than just technique. We talked about color as feeling, about composition as storytelling, about the act of creation as a form of meditation and healing. My evening classes became legendary at the community center. The waiting list grew longer each semester, and people would drive from across the city to study with me. Word spread that I didn't just teach painting. I taught people how to see their lives as art, how to find beauty in their own stories. Mrs. Monroe makes you feel like your paintings matter. One student told the center director, like what we're creating is important, even if we're just beginners. This period of intense teaching influenced my own work in unexpected ways. My paintings became more accessible, more hopeful. I was still dealing with themes of love, loss, and memory, but now there was also celebration of resilience, community, and the beauty of starting over at any age. I created a series called Silver Light, inspired by my older students and their courage in taking creative risks later in life. These paintings showed older hands creating art, wrinkled faces illuminated by the joy of discovery, the beauty of wisdom combined with wonder. The series was exhibited at several galleries and attracted attention from art critics who noted how I was challenging stereotypes about aging and creativity. Monroe's Silver Light series celebrates the continued vitality and creative potential of older adults. One review stated, "These aren't paintings of people winding down. They're paintings of people blossoming." But the real reward wasn't critical acclaim. It was watching my students discover parts of themselves they didn't know existed. I saw formerly shy people become confident in expressing their opinions about art. I watched people who thought they were too old to learn master complex techniques and develop distinctive personal styles. Some of my students became quite accomplished artists themselves. Eleanor started selling her paintings at local craft fairs. Frank had a piece accepted into a juried exhibition. Margaret joined a local artists cooperative and began showing her work regularly. "You taught us that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be," Eleanor said during our end-of-semester celebration one year. She was 80 by then, and her latest painting, a bold, colorful interpretation of a sunset over Lake Michigan, was hanging behind her as she spoke. By the late 1990s, I had been teaching for over a decade. My reputation as both an artist and educator had grown considerably. Art schools started inviting me to give workshops and lectures about working with older adult learners. I published articles about the intersection of art, aging, and personal growth. But more than any professional recognition, what mattered most was the community I had built. These weren't just my students. They had become my friends, my chosen family, my constant reminder that life continues to offer opportunities for growth and joy, even after great loss. As I approached my own later years, I realized that teaching had given me something precious, a sense of purpose that extended beyond my individual artistic career. I was part of something larger, a movement of people discovering that creativity doesn't have an expiration date, that it's never too late to pick up a brush and start painting your life in new colors. Here I am now, 70 years old, sitting in my studio surrounded by a lifetime of paintings and a room full of silver-haired students who still surprise me every week with their creativity and courage. My hands are more lined now, sometimes a little shaky when I hold the brush, but my vision is as clear as ever. When I look back at this long, winding path I've traveled, I'm amazed by how much life can fit into one person's story. That little girl painting with grape juice on the kitchen floor could never have imagined where art would take her. Through love and loss, success and struggle, community and solitude, always guided by the simple belief that beauty matters and creativity heals. The most important lesson I've learned is this. Art isn't just about creating beautiful objects to hang on walls. Art is about learning to see, really see, the world around us and our place in it. It's about finding ways to express what we feel when words aren't enough. It's about connecting with others across the barriers of age, background, and experience through the universal language of color and form. Every painting I've ever created, every student I've ever taught, every moment I've spent with a brush in my hand has been part of one long conversation about what it means to be human. We love, we lose, we grieve, we rebuild, we hope, we create, and in the creating, we find meaning. To anyone listening to my story, especially those who think it might be too late to start something new, I want you to remember this. You are never too old to pick up a brush, to see the world with fresh eyes, to discover parts of yourself you didn't know existed. Your story is still being written, and you get to choose what colors to use. The little girl with purple-stained fingers became a woman with paint-stained hands who learned that love doesn't end when people die. It just finds new ways to express itself. Every time one of my students creates something beautiful, every time someone stops in front of one of my paintings and feels understood, Tommy's love continues through my work. That's the real masterpiece, not any single painting I've created, but the lifetime of connections, the community of artists, young and old, the understanding that creativity is how we make sense of it all. At 70, I'm still learning, still growing, still painting the world as I see it. Full of color, full of possibility, full of love that transcends even death. Keep your eyes open for the beauty that surrounds you every day. And when you find it, don't just look, create something from it. Share it with the world. That's how we keep the light alive.